Velina mai me ke aloha e ka lehu. We are Ka'ahalahui o Olekona Hawaiian Civic Club of Oregon and Southwest Washington, a nonprofit organization with a mission to actively participate in the promotion, perpetuation, and practice of the Native Hawaiian culture and values. One of our goals is to participate in activities which promote the civic, economic, health, education, and social welfare of our community, and particularly the activities of those agencies and clubs who are responsible for the improvement of the conditions of the people in the community. Throughout these efforts, we would like to welcome Na Kamaliʻi Talk Story, a program offering a safe place for open discussion and conversations around social justice, equity and equality, cultural appropriation, climate change, and education that will be led and driven by today's youth. Before we introduce our panelists, we'd like to share a brief history behind the Black Lives Matter network organization and movement. The Black Lives Matter network began as a Black-centered political movement in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. They formed the hashtag Black Lives Matters movement in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. Since 2013, the network organization has evolved to become member-led with over 40 chapters worldwide. In addition to other events, they organized the Black Lives Matter Ride in 2014 to stand with the communities of Ferguson and St. Louis after the murder of Mike Brown by Ferguson officer Darren Wilson. Today, the organization is involved organizing protests in response to social injustices in the Black community. So please join me as we welcome today's host, Mema. Aloha, Mema.
Aloha. Mahalo, Uncle. Aloha, my name is Mema. I'm an incoming freshman in the Beaverton School District, and my pronouns are she and her. We would like to welcome all of you to what we hope will become a safe and open platform for many of our students and peers out there. Before we get started with today's panel discussion, as a member of this community here in Oregon, we would like to acknowledge and mahalo the land and its people to which we sit and occupy. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Klamath, Clackamas, Bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. To learn more about Portland's native, diverse, and vibrant community, please read Leading with Tradition, a document created by the Portland Indian Leaders Roundtable. Before we begin, I would like to introduce and welcome our panelists who will be joining us today. Dr. Akiemi Glenn is a Honolulu-based nonprofit leader, curator, and systems-oriented qualitative researcher. She holds an MA and PhD in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a BA in linguistics from New York University. She is the founder and an executive director of the Popolo Project, which is an organization that explores concepts of culture, race, and belonging in Hawaii and the Pacific region. Dr. Glenn works at the intersection of rich vectors of change and resilience in education, the arts, and cultural programming. Under Dr. Glenn's leadership and curatorial direction, the Popolo Project challenges how we understand the convergence of African and Pacific diasporas in Hawaii by offering cultural and educational programming that specifically reframes history of colonialism and resistance, connections to land, cultural and artistic practice, and the visibility of Black people in the Pacific region. Aloha, Dr. Glenn. Jody King has been an assistant principal at Wood Middle School in Wilsonville, Oregon for the past 3 years. Prior to that, he was a school counselor for 7 years at Pointer Middle School in Hillsboro, Oregon. Mr. King is mixed race, identifies as half Black, and was adopted at birth by 2 white parents. He has 1 adopted sibling that is white and 1 adopted sibling that is from India. The unique makeup of his family and his experiences as a person of color, growing up in a predominantly white community, has informed his work as an educator as well as his work with equity and anti-racism. Aloha, Mr. King.
Aloha.
Molly MacGregor identifies as a Midwest white cis, and hetero woman working towards being an ally and activist in all areas. Mrs. MacGregor received her undergraduate degree in social justice from Hamline University, and her thesis focused on the Turkish minority in the German school system. She received her master's in education from the University of Oregon and is now living in Portland and learning with students since 2010. Mrs. MacGregor is a member of the ACLU, NAACP, and SURJ. Aloha, Mrs. MacGregor. Mahalo nui loa for being here today. As we begin, a friendly reminder to please mute while you are not talking. Please raise your hand so that we can call upon you, and please feel free to be completely open and honest. To open up our discussion, I would like to ask Dr. Glenn our first question. What does Black Lives Matter mean, and how is the movement addressing the way that Black people are being treated in our community?
Thank you, Mema. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this discussion. I'm really happy to be a part of this panel and this conversation. I think this question is a really good one for us to start with because we're seeing Black Lives Matter all around, but this is a hashtag that started many years ago. About 7 years ago, it started circulating, though the idea is an old one. I think the phrase Black Lives Matter is really trying to invite our community to understand the ways that Black lives often are not mattering to people, the ways that they're often not visible. So the phrase Black Lives Matter is not only an assertion saying something is true, but it is also a plea and a call to our larger community to recognize that Black people are fully human and that our families, our histories, our identities, and our actual lives and physical safety are really important. So a big part of what this movement signifies, I think, is kind of shifting the frame, the way that we think about how our society works. And it's a really powerful movement for those reasons.
Mahalo, because I feel like in our schools today, we're not really given the opportunity to learn how Black Lives Matter is an assertion and how that our safety is most important. So I hope that later on in the future, we will be able to have that opportunity so that we can go more in detail of that. So mahalo. Anybody else? No one? Okay. Our next question
I think
goes.
Mr. King wanted to say something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't quick enough with the hand raise. Yeah, I just I think Mema, as you were kind of talking, I do think that schools. I hope that within this upcoming year that's going to change. That there will be more direct abilities for schools and districts to enter into these conversations. I think schools sometimes get paralyzed by feeling like, hey, as a public entities and as educators, you're public servants, and there can be challenges around how to not want to make your opinions sound like the opinions of the school or the district, especially when something seems like it's a very political thing. What I think has happened in the last couple months especially is there's a growing awareness that Black Lives Matter isn't about a political, one party or the other or anything like that. It is an issue of humanity, and that's something where, yes, as all people, we should be very, very interested in seeking more humanity, and that means as schools we need to be at the forefront of helping guide young people around that and helping expose them to what's going on and how do we become better people and better communities.
Mahalo. I never thought that humanity could be such a big word, especially for Black Lives Matter in education. So I believe that there's so many meanings behind humanity, and I feel like it'll be very helpful for students to know how this could be helpful for our future. So, mahalo. Our next response is from Mrs. MacGregor.
Yeah, this is a really great question that you came up with, and I really like how you're relating it to the schools too. As a teacher in Oregon, I think it's really important that schools hear from students like you that you want to talk about this. I think something that is can be challenging for everybody is that this type of topic, specifically regarding race and Black Lives Matter, a lot of people have strong feelings about, and it's really a really great time and space to be able to practice how do we talk about these things that people have strong feelings about, and support students learning how to talk about them in ways that are respectful, but also ways that are uncomfortable and really push people's knowledge of how do we speak about hard things. So I think areas like this are a great start. And I think students like you are a great start in, asking your teachers, hey, this is something we need to talk about. And I really appreciate when students do that, because then, like Mr. King said, I don't feel like it's me pushing something on people. I feel like it's me correctly responding to what students want to talk about. So thanks.
Yeah, because you never know what kind of backgrounds all the students come from. And some students, they don't talk about it in their family, and they kind of have this sense of being uncomfortable. So I feel like once a student asks their teacher, it'll open up a more discussion so that they'll feel more comfortable to join in.
I think you're really right with that.
Mahalo everyone for your responses. Our next question is going to come from Kamaliʻi.
Put on your camera.
Mr. King, I would like to start with you if that's okay. What are some issues that Black Lives Matter movement is trying to combat?
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. And one thing that I think with all this, something that I just really encourage everybody, especially students and young people, but this truly is for everybody, is to be critical thinkers, to be critical questioners, to be critical demanders. That's true when you're in school with your teachers, what's being presented to you, with all that type of stuff. And I think that's a good frame for even this question of, what are some of the issues the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to combat. Is, I encourage, like, part of the critical thinking is, like, because people may have different opinions of what they've heard, one thing is checking out what is the actual movement saying, and they have their website and their leaders within the organizations, and I think that's a huge piece of trying to find the sources and find the credible sources, and that's big. And so even for me thinking about that question, I was like, well, gosh, I might have my thoughts, but I need to do that. I need to go to as direct of a source as possible. And when I did that, the things that stood out is what the Black Lives Matter movement says is their issues they're trying to combat are state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. Those are like the big statements they have as a part of their mission. And that state-sanctioned violence, that's speaking to the treatment of Black people from law enforcement and the patterns and the history that's within that. And then the anti-Black racism, includes so many of the different systems, and and I think I guess the last piece I would say is one thing that is really tricky in all of this is trying to determine the difference between symptoms and systems. If we think of a situation, like what we've seen in the news in the last couple of months of a officer misconduct, and somebody doing something really horrible towards an officer doing something really horrible to a citizen, and what sometimes happens from that is there's the call to, like, hey, that officer needs to be removed and charged criminally for their actions because what they did was not okay, and that's totally true. But if you just get rid of that person that wasn't doing their job as an officer or as a human correctly, that's getting rid of a symptom. The deeper part and the more challenging thing is the systems that created the ability for that person to learn those things, foster that type of contact, and allow it to just even happen. And so I think that's part of what Black Lives Matters and again, lots of different organizations and people are struggling with, like, how do we take care of the symptoms, but also how do we try and uncover the deeper parts so that these things don't just continue to happen. And so, yeah, those are, and that's a huge task for any one organization. And the great part is that there's a lot of different organizations that are all kind of trying to come together around this.
Thank you.
Mahalo for your response. Does anybody have any other thoughts to add on? Okay. Our next question is going to come from Kina.
Mahalo, Mema. My next question, I would like to start with Mrs. MacGregor. As an incoming 5th grader, I keep hearing people reference police brutality. What is police brutality?
That's a great question, Kina. Thank you. Like Mr. King, I did some research because I was like, well, I know what it means, but I want to know like the official definition of what our country thinks it means. And so I looked online. I'm going to use my notes for this. And the wording that our system of government uses is, oh, where did it go? Excessive force. So in the, within the police and criminal justice system, it says, you know, the idea of excessive force is that, sorry, I wrote it all down to make sure that I said it correctly. Okay, is in excess of what an officer believes is necessary. And I got that from the Cornell Law Association. So the challenge here is that we have a police system, like Mr. King said, that is having police officers be the ones who decide what is an excess of force. And I think that is a really hard judgment call to make and to put on an individual officer. The things that have been happening specifically because of racist systems and racist officers and people is that police brutality has been pointed primarily towards and racial profiling BIPOC communities. And so these communities, and what I read on the NAACP website, they're calling for specific things to combat some of this police brutality or excessive force that we've seen happen throughout the years since the beginning of the police system. The NAACP is specifically calling for a ban on knee or chokeholds. So they're saying we should just make that a rule that that is excessive force. People should not be able to do that. And they're saying it'll be more helpful to the officers when making decisions about what is excessive force if there are clear steps put into place in the police system for how do you know when to escalate something. And they outline 6 specific steps. They're also asking for an Open Records Act, which up until now, a lot of records about police who have used excessive force or who have been found guilty of misconduct are kept within the police system. And the NAACP is saying, well, people should have access to that. All people should have access to that. And the last two would be, one of the big ones that I saw was a citizens review board. So even if the police officer thinks that the force was not excessive in a situation, that there are citizens and a part of the community that all come together and weigh in on that and say, well, you know, what was happening and was that a correct response? I know a lot of times when I have to make really big decisions, I need a lot of other people weighing in on what I'm doing to check and make sure that what I'm doing is correct. So similar to being a part of this discussion today, I said, well, this isn't, I can't just speak for myself or only say what I know. I need to look and see what other people are saying and make sure that I am correctly reflecting the community. So that was a really long answer, but that's a start of what people are talking about when they're talking about police brutality. And I think this is a really great start to find out what your definition of that would be. And it's a great start to, you know, look at some other places online, like Mr. King said, do your research too, and then talk to other people and come up with your definition. What do you think it is, and where do you think you've been seeing that or not seeing that?
Mahalo, I really understand now what it means, and yeah, that can be a lot of weight over someone's shoulders.
Right? Yeah.
Mahalo for your response. Does anybody have any other thoughts to add in? Good. Okay. Our next question comes from Sophia.
Aloha. Mr. King, as a person of color, I'm often a part of the conversation when it comes to racial profiling. However, just like our first discussion with Mema, our schools have not educated us on what the meaning of racial profiling is. So can I ask, what is racial profiling, and how does it affect the way certain groups of people are treated?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. So that, you know, similar in scope of around the police brutality question of, you know, the definitions and understanding these things are super important. And with racial profiling, you know, it's the law enforcement practice of using race or ethnicity. They even talk about sometimes it could be national origin, religious appearance as a factor when that comes into play when police are suspicious enough to warrant something like a police stop or questioning or frisks or searches or other routine practices. And you know, a huge piece, like I talked about being a critical thinker, critical questioner, is I realized I didn't acknowledge the fact that that's true for me as well. Like that never should stop. We should always be seeking and trying to learn and understand more and digging in. And you know, and so with this idea of racial profiling, you know, as a person of color and knowing other people of color, like I've heard and seen and, you know, experienced that. And so there's a reality there of, yeah, like I've seen people get treated totally different, even though they're doing the same thing, and it's all based on, the only difference that seems to be there is the color of their skin. And, you know, for some people that is, the personal stories are enough where they hear that and that makes the connection. For other people, they need to see data. They need to see the research. And so one thing I would encourage, there's a organization, it was, let's see, it is the Stanford Open Policing Project. And this is something that the university, Stanford University, a group of researchers did this thing where they analyzed over 200 million records of traffic stops and search data from across the country. And they have a website and you can kind of look at their data, but I think this is a great example of what racial profiling is, because what they show is that Black motorists are stopped and searched at higher rates than white motorists. And they also dig in there more and show that, like, it's not because Black motorists are doing more illegal activity or illegal activity at a higher rate. They actually show that it's pretty comparable, and actually in a lot of situations, it's white motorists and white people that have more illegal substances on them more frequently. But it is still the Black and brown people that get stopped more, that get searched more, and all those type of things. And so that's just a really clear example. And again, the numbers sometimes help people understand it more of, wow, there is an issue. And it isn't a matter of opinion. It's like there's some facts that are there that show it. And also my apologies to everybody. There's construction happening by me, and so I tried to get away from that, and now somebody's mowing their lawn. And so I don't know, I'll try and limit it as much as possible, but my apologies if there's background noise.
That's totally fine. I just want to say mahalo. I'm really excited to hear that there's actually some way for us to find data, and I'm really happy that people are actually taking the time to write down how many all those police stops. It's really important, especially in the big picture. And going back to what you were saying to Hina and Kamalani, I really like what you said about your definition, because right now we're asking you, and there's a kind of a difference between from the dictionary and then from personal experiences, and I really praise you for that. So mahalo.
Mahalo for your question, Sophia. Our next response comes from Mrs. MacGregor.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on and support what Mr. King has been saying. A lot of times as a white person too, needing to see those statistics because I don't think about that or haven't thought about that in the past, I can ask myself as a white person, when I'm in that situation, if I get pulled over because my taillight's out or something, is race something that I'm worried about in that situation? Am I worried that a person coming to me and seeing that I'm white is going to change their reaction to this situation? And in reflecting on a lot of that, and I've seen a lot of other people, white people, reflecting on this too, a lot of us can say, no, that isn't something that we've had to think about or have thought about when we're in different situations. And so I think that's the other side of things too. Where does your brain have to go to in certain situations? And that's a part of the white privilege. That's a part of the system of our country, right? That's not a factor that I've had to think about. I could have grown up and keep going on without thinking about it. And that's the other side of the statistics and stuff. Reflect on when do you think, if you think about your race?
Mahalo. I love what you said about white reflection, because it might just be who I'm hanging out with, but I know a lot of white people that are actually are on the Black Lives Matter side. It just kind of depends on who you are, and I really appreciate that.
Our next response is coming from Mr. King.
And Sophia, I just also want to appreciate you making that connection of creating your own definitions, right? And doing the work to do that. And I think that's so important because, your generation, for all of you students, you're going to be the ones that are leading this and leading our country into its new and better places, but also the impact that you have on your peers, and the definitions and the ways you're able to describe stuff are going to have a much different impact than us old adult people, and it's going to hit differently and maybe make more sense in newer ways. And so your willingness to do that is going to have a huge impact.
Mahalo. Exactly. The way I kind of see it is like, obviously there's the dictionary description, but it's almost like describing it to like somebody in elementary school. You have to break it down and make it kind of depend on how they live. And mahalo.
Dr. Glenn has some thoughts to add on.
Yeah, this is a great discussion, and I think this conversation around definitions is really important. And I just want to acknowledge that, part of the reason why we're able to have this conversation is because we're able to ask these kinds of questions and answer. And as we have these conversations, our definitions get better. And just like Sophia was saying, when you're explaining to someone, say in elementary school, you have to think about different vocabulary to use. And it's really important for us to practice having these conversations so that we can make sure that everyone understands what the issue is at stake. And I just wanted to add a couple concepts to this as we're talking about racial profiling, and they're related concepts. So one is implicit bias and the other is explicit bias. So a big part of the way that racial profiling works is this idea that even if you haven't seen someone necessarily commit a crime or do something wrong, you have a hunch that because they belong to a category that they've been assigned to either by you or by society at large, that they might have engaged in some activity. And I think many of us as people of color have experienced that, and the ways that implicit bias shapes how people expect you to behave or imagine what your experiences have been. And it's called implicit because it's not necessarily something that someone can put their finger on all the time. So they might look at me, and this has happened in my life, and people have assumed lots of things about me based on what I look like, what my hair looks like, and what my skin looks like, and then are often very surprised to learn more about my story or who I am or what my interests are. And often those people are not doing that because they're racist and dislike me, but it's because the stories that we tell in our larger society have given them an idea, a profile essentially, of what someone who looks like me and maybe comes from the background that I do might be. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge those things too, that it's not necessarily just a personal prejudice that shapes how people react in the moment. It's our larger society, it's our culture, it's the examples that we have in news media, the ways that we talk about people's experiences that shape that. On the other side, explicit bias is very upfront, and that might be something a little bit more akin to, people using certain words or actively upfront discriminating against people and saying, no, you cannot participate in this thing because you are X type of person. But it's important to understand that these are on a continuum and they're related to each other. And so getting words like implicit bias and explicit bias out there helps us understand these concepts and helps us understand that even though it might be undercover and we're just kind of reacting to expectations we have that are formed by our exposure to concepts over our whole lives, starting in childhood, that we can interrupt those. And having conversations like this one allows us to kind of change the way that we show up in our communities.
Mahalo, Dr. Glenn. I have to be real. I totally agree. The first time I see something, I kind of stick to it unless something definitely changes my mind. And I think we do have to break those stereotypes. And we are definitely on the journey, but it's going to take a long time.
Mahalo, Sophia, and everyone. All of your thoughts have opened up new ideas I thought that I would have never thought of. And so I hope to bring that to the next generation. And so thank you all so much. And so moving on, our next question comes from Chloe.
Mahalo, Mema. So this question is kind of like going off of what we talked about before, like with racial profiling. It's for any of you if you want to answer. So there have been a lot of instances where kids of color have been mistakenly killed because they were holding something that was suspected to be a gun. So how do you think the situation would have been different had the kid been white?
Does anybody have a first response? Mr. King?
I think, you know, again, the data would say that it probably would be a different outcome. And, you know, I think, Chloe, you said something interesting is you said mistakenly killed. And, you know, in most of the stories that I think we've seen, in situations that we've seen, it was purposeful. You know, the action, the violence towards the individual was purposeful. The mistake happened was afterwards when they realized, like, oh, that actually wasn't somebody that was as dangerous as I thought. And again, what Dr. Glenn said, the implicit bias part plays so much in, and the racial profiling plays so much in, and all those things can impact the degree of force and whether something becomes police brutality and becomes murder and death. But you know, the job of law enforcement is a huge job, and to make the decisions that they have to make in split seconds is that's a huge burden, like we've already talked about. But you know, the stakes are also huge too when things like bias, whether it's implicit or explicit, come into play. Like the impact of that can be these horrible tragedies. And you know, so I just think that that's a huge piece, is that oftentimes the people make the action that they think is right, but they're maybe the things that are informing them are what's wrong. And yeah, so I just think that's important to acknowledge.
Thank you. And also for what you said about it being mistaken. Like, I kind of like, sometimes, a lot of times it's hard to like say that a police officer did something wrong when you know that like they were just making the decision that they thought was right. And then that kind of ties into what Dr. Glenn said about like the biases that run through like maybe the police department that like lead them to make that decision. So thank you.
Our next response comes from Mrs. MacGregor.
Sorry, I thought I hit the unmute. A big part that I want to respect of the Black Lives Matter movement too is that we're saying the names of these people. Timothy Loman was the police officer who shot and killed Tamir Rice in 2014. So Tamir Rice was the 12-year-old boy who was killed because he had something that looked like a gun and because a police officer thought he was dangerous. I thought this was a really great question because I have actually just had this talk with my white 8-year-old son. He is very interested in getting like Nerf guns and water guns and that sort of stuff. And we have families in our circle that are people of color. And so we had a really specific conversation because we had talked about the racist police officer who killed George Floyd. And I said, you know, A of all, we've been talking about this. This probably isn't the best time for a white person to be running around with things that look like guns. So we sort of talked about that and how that looks within the context of this greater movement. And I also talked with him about Tamir Rice and said, there is a boy who was murdered because he had a gun. And my son said, oh, would someone shoot me if I had a Nerf gun? And I said, that is something that we as white people don't have to worry about as much because of these implicit and explicit biases that are in our society. And I said, but we also have to worry about if you want to invite your friends out, we want to make sure that your friends are safe too. And we want to work on changing it so that if people do want to play with, you know, Nerf guns or water pistols or whatever, that they can do that if they want. There was also, it was really interesting when I was reading up on this more, there was another 12-year-old white boy who wrote like an op-ed piece, Connor Merritt, who lived like 30 minutes from Tamir Rice, and really talked about his experience, like going out and playing with Nerf guns and water pistols and that sort of stuff, and how he said, you know, it never came to my mind that I would have to be afraid of somebody or the police mistaking this for a real gun, and I would not have been shot in those situations. So I think that was a really great, that was an example of another 12-year-old, another kid like you guys speaking about his experience. So long story short, I think it would definitely be a different outcome and has been a different outcome if a white boy was running around with a fake toy gun.
Thank you. And like what you said about having to like say the names of the people involved in these incidences, I think that is something that it's a lot of people should get used to, like including myself, because like their deaths made a huge impact on like this whole movement that's been lasting for years. And also what you said about looking at like things from ourselves that possibly like how we can change on how we conduct ourselves regarding things like this. So thank you.
Dr. Glenn, did you have any thoughts?
I did. I just want to share kind of a little bit of a personal perspective. So, you know, I'm Black, African American, and I grew up mostly in the southern part of the United States. And I have a younger brother. So when we were children, I won't say exactly when, but it was in the last 40 years or so. When we were kids, a big part of our family life, and certainly my parents spending time with us, was trying to make sure that we would stay safe and stay alive. And just as Mrs. MacGregor is talking about having the conversation with her son, our parents had very different kind of complementary conversations with us as well. And as you were talking, Mrs. MacGregor, it reminded me of my brother one year wanting a water gun and being really, really excited about it. It was very hot that summer and he just wanted to play with his friends. And I remember my dad sitting down with him and saying, you know, these are the conditions under which you can have this thing. And they were very restrictive. And my brother not understanding it and feeling really frustrated and put out, because we lived in a neighborhood that was, you know, mixed, all kinds of people lived there. And his friends had those things. But my dad was trying to explain to him, there are different rules that apply to you. Fast forward a few years, and my brother, when he started driving, he was 16 years old. My mom sent him to the supermarket to get a loaf of bread on Sunday night before school was going to start the next morning so he could make his lunch for the week. And he was followed by a police officer who didn't think that he lived in our neighborhood. And when he pulled into the driveway, the police officer blocked the driveway and came out of the car with his gun pointed at my brother. He, you know, he had done nothing. He'd been in his vehicle the entire time, and it was literally just going from the supermarket home. He, you know, threatened my younger brother with a gun, asked him if he had drugs, those kinds of things. And of course he didn't. and let him go. And my brother went inside, but there was nothing that my mom or anybody else could do about the fact that this had happened. And so when she called the police department in our town, they said, well, he wasn't arrested, nothing happened to him. And I share the story just to kind of put some context around this, because these moments of police brutality and excessive use of force are not just about when people die. They're also about the kind of fear that gets foisted on young people. So my brother, from the time he was asking for the water gun until the moment that he had a gun pulled on him, was living in fear. And a lot of our childhood was our parents trying to keep us safe and alive by teaching us how to modify our behavior. And it's really important, even as we're talking about this current moment and a lot of people who've been killed in the last few years, that this is just a tiny subsection of Black people who've been killed in the last several hundred years, and certainly in the last 100 years. You know, one of the biggest civil rights kind of moments was the killing, who was not killed by, was in Mississippi, and he was also. So I think it's important, even as we're thinking about what's happening now, to understand that this is part of a, unfortunately, much longer story, and that even if we're not talking about people who have been killed, many of us have still been touched by the possibility and the fear of being killed in those ways.
Thank you for sharing your story and your perspective on this, because it helps me be able to realize things that I may not have thought of in the past, and like it's about more than just people dying. It's like this entire group of people that like face this constant state of fear that I don't experience. So thank you.
Our next response comes from Mr. King.
And Dr. Glenn, just thank you for sharing that, because, you know, as you said, that sparked this this reality of recognizing that for the Black community and so many people of color, it has turned into the responsibility of the people of color to keep themselves safe, to change the rules, to have to learn different ways of doing things or going about things in order to stay safe, when it should be the complete other way around. It should be the system is set up in a way that keeps all people safe. And again, I think that's you know, the heart of social justice and of different movements is, how do we make it so it's not the people, the individual people having to protect themselves, but it's that the systems are set up so that people aren't having to be in fear, aren't having to do these type of things. And so, yeah, but I mean, again, your example, Dr. Glenn, is just really highlighted that for me, and just makes that stand out even more. Just like being reminded, like, yeah, it shouldn't be the people that are experiencing and being targeted that have to do all of the work to protect themselves and to stay safe.
Thank you for adding on and what you said about like how the system is supposed to protect the people, not the other way around. So I think that is true, and it's something I don't really think about often, about like the faults in the system, because to me they just kind of exist, right? And a person like in my living situation can go their whole life thinking like the system is just, it exists and it's there, and but in reality, like these it could affect they have negative effects on a lot of people. Thank you.
Mrs. MacGregor, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, mahalo. This is a great discussion. I really appreciate being in community with all of you. One of the things that the students had asked for was more resources, and I wanted to put a plug in for watching 13th, which is a great historical breakdown of how our police system, Chloe, you were talking about systems, how it was set up, what it was set up for, and why we have these symptoms of that system today. So moving forward, if you want to look at that, it also has a lot, it does a really great job of saying, you know, I got these statistics from here. And one of the questions had been about, you know, how do you find unbiased facts? And everybody has their biases. And I think it's important to look at, you know, if we see something as unbiased, it is probably inherently supporting some of those systems. So we have to look at what we think might be biased and say, okay, well, this is a different perspective, and which perspective do we need to learn more about here? So yeah, so watching 13th, talking about it with friends, talking about it with family, that's a really great history lesson too.
Thank you. I actually watched it the other day with my sister, so that it gave a lot of good historical context and like why the systems are the way that they are. So.
Does anybody have any other responses to add on? Mahalo for your question. Our next question comes from Kamaliʻi.
Turn your audio on.
It is.
Did you turn the mic on?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Gunn, you feel that Black people get misunderstood more than white people?
Thank you for the question, Kamaliʻi. I think that's a really great question, and I think it's complex, right? So we're thinking about all different kinds of people. But one of the things I can say in response to your question is that thinking about, you know, that comment that I made about implicit bias and where that comes from, it comes from our culture, images, and the difference of what of people that they can be than we get of Black people and of people of color in general. So we often, you know, you can see a story on TV that's about a white scientist or someone who's a criminal who happens to be white, and you don't necessarily have to form the idea that those are the only two options of how white people can be. But in contrast, we often have very limited representations of Black people and people of color. Things are getting better, but we still don't have enough diversity of our experience represented. So I think that that's one of the main places where our ideas about Black people or white people or any kind of people on the planet you know, come from. And I think especially for a group like this, you guys might understand too that I'm here in Hawaii, and Hawaii is another place that often gets really misrepresented. A lot of images of Hawaii are just about vacation. And for those of you who have connections here or who have spent time here, you know that this place is much, much more complex and diverse than it ever gets represented in kind of mainstream TV. So when I talk to people here in Hawaii about the ways that Black people are represented, or even ideas that folks have about Black people here, I often point to that. We know that Hawaii is not just vacations. We know it's so much more than that. And it's important to afford that idea to other people too, especially when we don't know them and their background, to let them tell us who they are, rather than just assume who they are based on what we've seen of them.
Thank you.
Our next response comes from Mr. King.
Yeah, I again just appreciate everybody, and yeah, I'm learning throughout this, and again, things are being sparked for me. So thank you all for the questions and the awesome responses, and the word that sparked from what Dr. Glenn was saying is that idea of assuming, right? And there's this, are Black people or people of color being misunderstood, or is it more of like, are they being misassumed? And and I don't even know if that's a word, but I think that an interesting part of that is it does shift the frame from again, it's not about the person of color necessarily doing something wrong or not expressing it in the right way, and because if it's about expression, then it's like, oh well, you expressed it in a way and I didn't understand what you were trying to do. But when it's about assumption, that places it on, it has maybe nothing to do with the actions or words of the person of color, and it's all again about that bias piece. And what do I assume that person is doing? What do I assume their intentions are? Do I assume that they are dangerous or that they are doing something wrong? And so again, our brains work in interesting ways, but as we start to put language to it and some of the words to what's going on, sometimes that helps bring some clarity to what we're witnessing and what certain people, and again, particularly people of color and Black people in our country, are experiencing. And assumption is that massive piece within that.
Thank you.
Our next response comes from Mrs. MacGregor.
Thank you. Yeah, these are all, it's really great to be hearing everybody's ideas on this. I think too, the important thing to put in place when thinking about misunderstandings is who has power in those situations. So I could be misunderstood. And like I said before, I wouldn't automatically be questioning, are people misunderstanding me because I'm white, right? I would be like, oh, well, they misunderstood me, whatever, and I could move on. Now, because the system of this country is set up specifically so that white people have more power, and it's been set up and defined that way throughout our history. If somebody from the BIPOC community is being misunderstood, then we have to look at how is that taking more power away from that person or that group of people too? And who is misunderstanding, and does that person have power to take rights or life away from people? So the misunderstanding piece, that was a great question. And then thinking about, well, when does that come into play and who has power in those situations?
Thank you.
Thank you, Kamaliʻi, for your question. Does anybody have anything else to add on? Okay, our next question comes from Kohoku.
Okay. Mahalo, Mima. I would like to start with Dr. Glenn. What are some everyday actions that we can do to help support the Black community?
Mahalo for your question. I think, there's been a thread in this conversation so far around learning. People are asking questions about how do we get more information? How do we get access to data? How do we listen to each other's stories? So I would first encourage everyone who's interested in supporting the Black community to learn from us, whether you have friends in your community or your school. Ask them about their experience. One of the things is that we all have very different experiences. I live here in Honolulu. I grew up in the southern part of the US. I have a very different experience here than some of my family do elsewhere, but it's important for us to share our stories with each other and see where there are patterns and where there are differences as well. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. Once you've taken the time to learn, I think that there are behaviors that we can change. We've talked about a couple of them. So one is, once you've learned about the diversity of people's experiences, check yourself if you find yourself making assumptions about them, or thinking when you see somebody on the street who looks a certain way that they must have this other activity that they're doing or this other way of life. Really just be open. And I think that that's actually a muscle that we can work. It's something that we can practice. There are also community organizations. As Mrs. MacGregor was saying, she's part of the NAACP. I'm sure there are local organizations there. My organization, the Popolo Project, is here in Hawaii as well. And I think actually connecting with us and having a relationship with Black people, if you don't already, is really important, so that not only when moments like this that are very intense and often scary and we're not really sure what to do, call us to be together as part of a community, but all the time, so that we can continually be supporting each other. And as the other panelists were saying, recognize each other's humanity. And one of the ways that we do that is by connecting with each other as humans all the time. So those would be my recommendations.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to add on? So our next question comes from Ku'ule.
Hi. So this question is kind of direct. Well, may I ask this question to Miss MacGregor first, if that's okay? How can we bring up and explain Black Lives Matter or the movement to adults or people in positions of power who are arguing for all lives matter? And would you also explain if you know what all lives matter means, or like what people mean when they are arguing for all lives matter?
Yeah, mahalo. Great question. This is a question that is commonly brought up and continues to be brought up. A big part of, there are a bunch of great examples. I'll say a bunch of great examples that I've heard before. When I think about talking with other people about the Black Lives Matter movement, and people might get sidetracked by this, well, all lives matter movement. I always go back to, what is the intention of that movement? Where does saying that bring us? Are we focused on a solution that is going to be uplifting and supporting our Black community? Or are we just going down a rabbit hole of, I want to argue about a word? And when I have heard people say all lives matter, I have heard them say that what I hear is that they have a problem with one word out of that lives matter movement, right? And it's not about furthering solutions for our country. It's about talking about the all. The other common responses to that are, there is not an only in front of Black Lives Matter. It's not only Black Lives Matter, it's Black Lives Matter too. Other responses have been, if once Black Lives Matter, then all lives will matter. When I was teaching Black history, a lot of times the students of color in my class would say, okay, but like, what does this mean for me as a person of color if I'm not Black? And I said, well, in the history of our country, once Black people had finally been afforded a right or a basic civil liberty. It affected all people of color, because once we got to that, it like affected everybody else. All right. So the civil rights movement that was uplifting, and the Civil Rights Act that was uplifting for and focused on by Martin Luther King in community with a lot of other communities of color, lifted everybody up, right? Other examples, there's like the burning house example, right? So somebody says, hey, my house is burning down. I need the fire department to come, or I need some water to be thrown on it. And somebody else says, well, what about my house? What about maybe my house needs water, right? And the person with the burning house is like, well, yeah, that might be, but my house is literally burning down right now. So I'm not saying that your house isn't important. I'm saying we gotta focus on this big, horrible thing that's happening right now, and then, move on to your house. So those are a lot of the typical responses, some of my go-to responses when I hear people say all lives matter. And if there's somebody that is in my circle that I know pretty well and that I think will listen to me, a lot of times I'll say, it sounds like you have some really big opinions about that, and that's good, and let's talk about those, because your emotions surrounding this are probably similar to my emotions, and your reaction tells me that this is something that's important, so let's tweeze this apart together. This is an area of being an ally and activist that I can get better at, is trying to and talking to other white people who are saying that might not be in my circle, and challenging them on that, even if I'm not sure that they'll take something away from it. So that's my long answer. It's the best I got for right now.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful, and I will definitely be using those strategies in the future.
Does anybody else have any input on the question? Mahalo ku'ulei for your question. The next one I will be asking, and for Mr. King, if that's okay, I would like to ask, how can we, as the youth, support the BLM movement? If there's a more efficient way to help and create awareness other than protest, and are there other effective or safe methods in fighting Black inequality?
Yeah, thank you, Mayma. So, I know Dr. Glenn has touched on it. Ms. MacGregor has touched on it. And so I'd almost want to pose it as a couple questions to you all. So answering a question with a question, that's always a good strategy. But, it's the questions of like, what conversations are you having and with who? What learning are you doing? What voices are you listening to? And what are the voices you are raising up? A huge piece in all of this, and part of being an ally, part of being a part of a movement that you believe is important, is making sure that it's not just something that's what's been cool with all this movement is there's a lot of people interested, but sometimes that can get it can turn into like, oh well, did I do enough social media posts today to show that like, hey, I care? But there's a difference between that and actually like, how am I uplifting the voices of people that maybe aren't being heard because of the systems of oppression, and who are the Black authors that I need to be reading, and who are the Black leaders in my community that I need to connect with and hear from, and so there is all those pieces around learning, around using your voice. At times that's going to be something that's needed, and then there's times where it's like, how do I help make sure that this voice that's super important gets heard, that's, you know, on the front lines of all this. And so I've kind of used the idea of like, you know, you have to figure out the moments where you need to stand up and say something or do something. And then you also need to think about what are the moments where I need to sit down and learn and listen. But really thinking about those questions, yeah, of what conversations am I having? Who am I talking to? Who am I learning from? And what are some of the voices that I need to raise up or provide a platform for so that they can be heard more?
Yeah, I feel like those are the aspects that create a good supporter, because especially during now on social media, there are those who just post, they do posting about the BLM movement just to, you know, get a like and to be accepted that they're supporting. But at other times, sometimes you're kind of, you know, you have weight on your shoulders. Like, you want to be accepted and you want others to know that you are being a supported person, but sometimes it's going to be a rough situation. So to hear that you should understand who you're talking to, what voice you have, is going to be helpful along with you throughout, you know, during this pandemic, of course. So thank you for your response. Does anybody have any input? Okay, our next question comes from Haley.
Hi, my question is, what are the first 3 words that come to mind when thinking about the people who are protesting in the present time with the Black Lives Matter movement?
Does anybody have any input or first response to that? Dr. Glenn?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one of those that kind of, you know, catches you in the moment. I would say the first 3 words that come to mind for me are brave, continuing, because the Black Lives Matter movement under that hashtag is relatively new, but this is a very long struggle of hundreds of years and many generations before us. And I would say the 3rd word would be transformative. We've seen just the amazing groundswell of engagement in protest movement, both physically in our bodies out on the streets, but also in social media and advocating in every avenue of public life in America. We've seen things already start to change. Not enough has changed yet, but this continuing part is really important, because the reason that we're seeing the change that we are now is because people have been continuing to do this work, even when it wasn't trending in social media, even when it wasn't in the news. And so those are the 3 words that I would think of to describe the people who are doing this work now.
Does anybody else have a second response to the question? This question is like it's a very hard question, even on the spot. So there's gonna have to be a lot of thinking. So, Mr. King, do you have anything?
I might. I don't know if I can get 3 words, but I'll try. I do think one thing that has stood out to me, one word is diverse, that there is a variety of people that are involved. And I think, again, that's, and that kind of leads me to my 2nd word, which is hope. There's a hopefulness of, you know, that because it's not just one certain age, it's not one certain gender or orientation or you know, religious affiliation or anything like that, or you know, skin color, like that there is a diversity of people that are involved. And to me that means that there is also hope that that the work will continue and cause change, kind of like what Dr. Glenn said, of that continuing and that transformation piece. And, you know, and I also hope it brings clarity because I think that's one part that has been tough with, depending on the media sources and some people see certain demonstrations or see things that have turned violent, and some things have been attributed to Black Lives Matter that aren't. And I think that there are, you know, there are things that make it complicated, but the hope is with the more consistency and just the continuing nature of this, and continuing to have a message there of like, you know, this is about racism is not a debate. You know, I've seen that sign, that should not be a debate. And you know, that if people stay in it, there's a hopefulness that like things will actually change. So yeah, I think those would be the words that I would add in there.
Mrs. MacGregor, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, man, I love hearing other people's words for things. That always helps me become more clear in my thoughts too. So it's great to be here in community with you and with Dr. Glenn and with Mr. King. That was great. Yeah, going off of one of Mr. King's word, diverse, what I think is really cool about this movement is that in a lot of ways it's also decentralized. There's not one person who is, you know, doing all of the work, or one person that people can say, oh, well, it's just that person. It's everybody, everywhere, not everybody, but a lot of people everywhere taking part of this movement. And I think that's something that makes it really historic and really different than a lot of movements that we've seen throughout history. So being a history teacher, my next word is historic. I've seen a lot of people talking about, you know, if you ever wondered about what you would have done in the civil rights movement, think about what you're doing now. And that's, you know, that tells you what you would have done. So there are so many things that are happening right now that are history in the making. And the people making this history are, like Mr. King said, diverse from all over. And then the last one, man, I had so many things about like inspiring or amazing, or, you know, just I see things on television or going down my street and I'm like, yes, this is so good. But the other word I had down beginning, but sort of the idea similar to Dr. Glenn of ongoing, that these protests, this uprising, this revolution and freedom struggle is finally, for whatever reason, and it's great that it's doing it, putting enough pressure on our country to begin to change some things. But it's only a beginning and it can't stop here. There are so many things we've been talking about, systems of inequity and inequality. There are so many things that still need to change, that it can't just be, I'm gonna go out in the streets tonight. It has to be this ongoing change from people in power in our country. So those were a million words that came to mind, but I tried to narrow it down.
Mahalo. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. It's very inspiring, and to see all the words that you chose. Hopefully this inspires other people as well.
Mahalo, Haley, for your question. Our next question, oh, Mrs. MacGregor, do you have anything else to say? Oh, okay. Our next question comes from Sophia.
Hello again. What do you think about the riots going on across the country? Would you say that they are protesting in solidarity and supporting the BLM movement?
Would anybody have a first response to that question? Dr. Glenn?
Thanks for this question. You know, I think there are a couple of things just in the words that you chose to ask this question that I think are really important to point out. So one is the word riot. And I think what we're seeing is a really diverse array of tactics for protesting. Some of those have involved what people call property destruction. So I'm sure you have seen, you know, glass broken at shops, and we have seen fires. And while I don't necessarily want to say that is where we should be putting our energy primarily, it's really important that that kind of response, I think, is showing people that folks who are coming out are feeling really, they're feeling a lot of things. So one is frustration and grief and rage and anger. And I think that being able to demonstrate that in a public way has actually really, really caught the attention of a lot of us. As I said, this movement has been ongoing for many generations, and people have been doing this for a long time, advocating for Black people to be safe, essentially, and be able to live their lives. And the unfortunate history in the United States is that there have been moments like this where people have taken to the streets because they had no other way to be heard. I don't know if you folks know this, but the night that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, when he was murdered, the whole country erupted in what people called riots. Everyone was so hurt in Black communities across the country that they ran out. They didn't know what to do. They ran out into the street to be with each other, and of course to try to figure out what to do with this feeling of having someone who was advocating for them be killed in such a way. And you might know that after that, lots of things changed. There was new legislation introduced. Many cities across the United States named streets Dr. Martin Luther King Avenue, Boulevard, Black Lives on streets right now. And so I think it's important to understand that there's lots of different things. And as Mrs. MacGregor just said, we have a diversity of people, but also diversity of tactics and diversity of response to this moment. I also want to say that even though we're talking about things like breaking windows and fires, we're talking about the destruction of property, which can be repaired and rebuilt in response to the destruction of human life, which we can never get that back. George Floyd's family will never see him again. Breonna Taylor's family will never see her again, Ahmaud Arbery's family, and countless others. So even though it can be really scary, and it can be dangerous, of course, when people are engaging in these kinds of tactics, the comparison between the loss of property and items and objects is not valid in comparison to the loss of human life. So I think it's important for us to continue to try to keep that in context too, as we're learning more about this movement and what it can do.
Thank you so much. I totally understand frustration, rage. And like, not every time we get to share like this, and we just all it's just we strive to get noticed, and I think that's what a lot of people are getting. Another thing is like, I was actually like just driving in my neighborhood, and I went past my old elementary school, and I saw that they had a Black Lives Matter on their reminder board, and I just thought that was really amazing and important, because not is that really, it's still taking action. It's not being a part of the riots, but it's still activating and motivating curiosity to the kids that drive by, or to the kids who go to that school. And I really appreciate you saying that, because that's really, the riots are coming on social media and the news, and that's just like one of those signs on the road. It's activating curiosity. So mahalo.
Mrs. MacGregor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, mahalo, and thanks, Sophia, for this great question. I was also going to touch on the language of riots that Dr. Glenn said a lot about. That was great. And again, thinking about the language and power that language has. Who is calling these riots, and who is saying looting, who is using these words, and who are they being used for? I was looking at some words like from what was it, from Ferguson, when a lot of white people came out with tiki torches. Those people were described as white nationalists, right? And it was called a rally. So we need to look at how does our media talk about ideas and actions that are going on in our society. So I just thought that was really good. Also, and then going back to the idea of what do you say to people that say all lives matter? I think similar to talking about the riots, it's like another pathway to, for some people to get off topic or dismiss some of the experiences. And an important part of talking about these uprisings and revolutions that we're seeing going on throughout the country is saying and making people think about why do people feel so unheard that this is a way that they're expressing themselves, because it's a valid expression. And talking about that instead, right? And saying, okay, there might be this going on, but why are people doing that? And that's what's really important. So I just think those are two like really, really important areas to focus on. What are the feelings behind that? And these feelings are valid. And how do we make sure that people's voices aren't unheard and empower everyone?
Thanks. Going back to like, why are people doing that? I think a lot of people need to kind of, or organizations and other sorts, they also need to be asking that question. Why are people doing this, and what can we do to, you know, help understand them more better? That's not, but and just kind of like, what can we do to help and understand?
Our next response comes from Mr. King.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, and I think stays in line with what I talked about, it being a critically looking at what's going on, is there have been some instances over these last few months of things that have turned into what would be considered riots, but may not be attached. The people doing it may not be a part of a specific movement or organization, right? And sometimes, so it's always good to just be also looking at, sometimes situations can be lumped in of like, oh, that must have been Black Lives Matter, or that must have been this organization or that organization. And sometimes what is heard in media can give a perception of that. And so again, it's always good to just like to look and dig in and see like, and I think that's an encouragement too, if for students that are wanting to feel like, hey, I want to do some type of physical demonstration of actually showing up in person to something. And it can be really easy to just be like, okay, I'm going to search around and see, okay, cool, there's a demonstration or rally tonight, I'm just going to go. And always get like, find out who are the organizers, who are the people that are putting this on, what is their mission and goal within for that particular demonstration, and does that match with yours and what you believe in? Because you know, there are people that just show up to stuff and don't even know what they're showing up for. And again, it could be the right cause, or it could be some other group that actually isn't attached to what you really are passionate about and what truly matters. And so just again, that critical part of be a critical thinker throughout that, so that you make sure that, yeah, your body, your voice is being used in the way that is most that most matches, like, again, where your heart is and what you believe is most important.
Mahalo, Mr. King. You've definitely talked about this before in Mema's latest question. You talked about, educating yourself, learn more about, the authors, and that's just the most important thing, because if you're not really, if you're not really passionate, and if you're not passionate about this, a riot or anything, this cause, then, why risk your life and take those uncautioned things? And I really appreciate that you've said that.
Yeah, and I again, I think it's so important that we all educate ourselves. And I also want to recognize the fact that it is not all on young people. Like, as working in education, like, we need to step up in the ways that we help guide or help you all with some of the skills around critical thinking, some of the skills around finding out what are credible sources, ways of looking at multiple perspectives, and so we all have the individual work, but I also want all of you students, to hear and to know that us as the adults that are in positions where we are supposed to be helping to teach and guide, like, we need to be doing better and be doing more, so that it doesn't become just your responsibility, because it's all of our responsibilities, because again, this is a thing about humanity.
Yep, I totally understand. And I really appreciate those teachers and those adults who care about, a lot of people, they tell us, like, it's not until your generation, until things are really going to start to change and changes are going to start to be happening. But I really appreciate those people who are, like, pursuing these actions and, teaching us so that those things can happen.
Mrs. MacGregor, did you have anything to add on?
I was just going to say too, within this context, Kimberly Jones gave a really great viral video that you guys might have seen, using a Monopoly analogy to talk about how people are expressing themselves and being unheard. And I thought that was a really great, another really great resource as we're talking about resources in education.
I agree. Teachers are coming up with creative ways to kind of almost be like, kind of change the way that a lot of other people see Black Lives Matter, and they're just kind of switching the gears and making sure that the kids nowadays are understanding.
Mahalo, Sophia, for your question. Does anybody else have any other input? Okay, our next question comes from Chloe.
So in a time where there's like a lot of different opinions and like really diverse news media, where is the best place to get the least biased and most current information relating to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Mr. King?
So again, I would encouraged to check out the actual organizations to find out, so like the Black Lives Matter, their organization. But you such an important point about media and like even the stories you hear about, whether it's Black Lives Matter or really anything. And one thing that I want to encourage, there is an organization, and it's called Ad Fontes Media. And I'm sure we could get it sent out to you students if you want to. And they are, what they do is they look at all the different news sources and they rate them. I think they do it like every month because things shift and depending on what stories are coming out. And they rate them on reliability. Like, is this a reliable source? Is this something that's actually factual, or is this an opinion, or is this propaganda? So it has a spectrum. And then they also rate things on bias, and they rate it on the spectrum from, extreme far right from a political standpoint, or extreme far left, and everything in between. And it can be a really helpful tool to just see what what are maybe the different news outlets that maybe are giving the most accurate picture the most often. And because those may not be the ones that you see the most on social media or posted in different places, but those might be great sources to actually see and maybe gain some more insight of what might actually be going on. Or so again, if it is a story or a situation about Black Lives Matter movement, again, looking at some different sources and seeing where they might lie, because there may be bias there one way or the other. And again, it's just good to know what sources you can maybe trust the most.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because like a lot of times it's hard to differentiate what's real and what's not, and sometimes you can just assume that it's all fake. Like I don't know what to believe, so I just leave it alone. So it's good to know like where we can find information that's really reliable, especially in a time like this where we have to like rely on our own education. We're not at school, we have to teachers like that.
Mrs. MacGregor?
Yeah, so as a history teacher, this is something that we look at a lot, and I'm sure your language arts teachers have talked about it a little bit too. One thing that I always talk to my students about when looking for bias, or even just like doing an analysis of what you're reading, it's called soapstone. And it's looking at who is the speaker. So finding that author and saying, okay, doing some background checks. Who are they? What are they in support of? Finding the occasion. A lot of times people have a specific thing that they're reacting to when they're writing. Who's the audience? So who are they writing to? Are they using us or we or them in their statements? What's the purpose? What are they trying to convince people of? And then what's the subject? Like if you could summarize what this is all about, how would you do that in one sentence? And then the tone too. Are they being sarcastic and snarky? Are they making fun of something? Is it trying to be really neutral? And then that even tells us something too. But the biggest part is just getting a diversity of sources and looking and seeing, are these sources primary sources or reliable sources that you feel like you could trust based on doing that analysis, right? So we talked about like maybe one person's blog isn't enough of a whole picture to understand exactly what the movement's about. But like Mr. King said, going directly to an organization's website and seeing what they say about themselves. And then if they reference any other movements or organizations, looking at those too. Yeah, but a lot of this work is really just doing a lot of research and seeing, oh, they referenced this word like police brutality, and I'm not sure what it is exactly. So I'm going to go and look for the specific definition of what that is. And based on the questions that you are all coming up with, I can really tell that you're all very critical thinkers, and you have that first step of asking good questions to start thinking about where do we see bias in here. So really good job with that. I've just been impressed this entire time. It's really cool to be here with you.
Thank you. And all those tools for like being able to self-assess like a news article and stuff, it'll help us like as we continue to read more things, it'll help us be able to like filter out those biases and stuff ourselves as we're going through information. So thank you.
Mr. King, would you like to add?
Yeah, just recognizing that sometimes we jump into our answers, and sometimes we might use some big words or words maybe that not everybody knows or has heard. And so I know I mentioned on that kind of scale of reliability, and at the top of the scale is like facts, things that come like Miss MacGregor was saying, like primary source. That means it's coming directly from the initial source, right? It's not any of you guys that have played like the game Telephone, right, where like a message goes and it passes between like 7 different people and the message changes. So primary sources, it's like it's coming from the direct person or the immediate source. And then propaganda is, so facts and primary sources at the top, propaganda is at the bottom of that reliability, and propaganda is information that is misleading, and the purpose of it is usually to try and persuade or get somebody to believe something in a very certain specific way. And so that is the thing to trust the least. But again, in our current situation where it's so hard to tell. You don't know always what is something that is, again, I can trust, what is something that is propaganda, what's something that's factual. And so, again, finding the tools that can kind of help out with that. But, it's a challenge, and I know it feels like a lot of work to go through. But again, as you build the skills around kind of taking in and seeing maybe some of the signs, and kind of like what Ms. MacGregor said of, the tone, the who's the person that's saying, who's the author, those are keys that are going to help you start to uncover, okay, what can I trust and what should I be wary of, and maybe dig into a little bit more.
Thank you for that clarification on those terms. It gave more of a, definition to it. So thank you.
Mahalo for both of your responses. This question is going to connect with the next one, which will be asked by Noelani.
Hi, could you two please share some of your ways or maybe offer advice to students who are being bullied or judged because of the color of their skin?
Mr. King?
Yeah, so I, one of, well, I guess first to just acknowledge that is such a hard and challenging thing to have to face, and depending on where you're at, and if that's at school or in other places, there can be times where you feel like you might be alone in that, or nobody cares, or and that makes it an even harder situation. And what I would just offer is that at the school that I'm at with some of the teachers there, and Miss Pacheco, who's on this little panel or event, I guess you'd say, we started a Students of Color affinity group. And an affinity group is literally it's just a group of students that share something in common. And for us, it's with being students of color, it was a group of just students of color, and a space for those students to come together, to have some time to just like to connect, to share stories and experience. And sometimes that's just, you know, the super light and open stuff, and sometimes it's digging into like, man, yeah, this just happened to me, or sharing experiences that have happened in the past. And the safety of being in an environment where you know other people understand some of those aspects. They may not have had the exact same experience, maybe they have, but they at least have a better understanding of what those things are like. That was super powerful. And the students that participated in that, you know, it was huge for them. It was, we had students that said like, you know, it's like, I feel like this is a place where I can actually breathe. Like I can, like, you know, I can be me. I can, you know, I'm not carrying the weight of some of the other stuff. Like, and it gives me a break from that. So I would encourage you all, if the schools or places that you're at do not have an affinity group, or, you know, groups kind of like that, that's a great thing to advocate for, to find a teacher or somebody that works at the school that you can ask, like, hey, I want to start up a group. This is what we're thinking, and get something like that going. And so that would be one piece that is super helpful. And then the other piece of advice I would say, and this is just the reality of being a person of color, is there are, unfortunately, there are times where you have to make tough decisions. And a lot of times it's the decision between, do I speak up right now, or do I have to pick my battle? Is this the battle that I want to fight when something happens right in the moment? And is this safe? And it sucks that is something that people have to legitimately process, but it is reality. And so in that, what I would say is that sometimes silence in the moment might be the safe choice, you know, because again, if it's a dangerous or something where your safety is in harm's way because you're confronted right with that bullying or that you know, racism or whatever it might be, but that doesn't mean that you remain silent. What I'd always say is always at some point loop other people in, whether that's friends, trusted adults, family members, teachers, so that you aren't having to just always carry that weight alone, right? And so, yeah, if it's not a safe situation to confront the person that is expressing the racist thoughts or actions, or the prejudiced thoughts or actions, if you can't confront them right in that moment, make sure that you find somebody that you can tell what's going on, so that you can get some support in those ways. So I think those would be the big things. Find your group, get an affinity group started. That's huge. That's awesome. And then, yeah, if you have to be silent in a moment, make sure you don't remain silent. Make sure that you loop other people in.
Thank you. I really appreciate your advice, because when I was younger, like in elementary school, I used to get bullied a lot, and it was really hard for me, and I never really had someone to just tell everything to. And I think for people now, especially like kids, there are so many like things like to be insecure about, like they feel that they should be insecure about, like skin color, everything. Everyone needs to have someone to rely on, some people to tell everything to, people that can relate to them. And I think it's just a really powerful thing.
Mrs. MacGregor?
Yeah, thank you. And mahalo, Nalani. That is always hard to share stories that are, you know, bad memories and stuff. So thanks for sharing that with everyone. I want to say too, yes to everything that Mr. King said. And then on top of that, as finding affinity groups, a lot of the call is also to go out to, if we're talking specifically about race, to white people who are working towards being allies and activists, is if you, you know, if white people see something that they see as racial bullying or harassment, or or hate crime, that then white people, as we've said in our system in America, have power to be able to interrupt that. So a lot of the affinity groups, I'm in a affinity group, it's called SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice. And we talk about how do we support and uplift our communities of color, and then also interrupt racism when we see it. So those are just, I'll just say if there are any people who identify as white listening, if you hear that your friends are having experiences like this, it's never right, and you have the power in that situation to step in and say, this isn't okay.
Great, thank you. It's good to know that everybody has power in that type of situation. Like, it's good to know that everyone can step in. Like, no, you don't have to be just a silent bystander.
Mahalo nui Lenny for your question. Our final question for this panel discussion is actually a question from our viewers, and they're wondering, what does defunding the police really look like, as well as qualified immunity? Mrs. MacGregor?
Sure. So defunding the police, I like to see it as a reinvestment into a lot of other community services that have not been funded for a very long time. During the COVID crisis and people being out of schools, a lot of people noticed that, you know, there are a lot of things that are tied to our school systems that support our community. I think, you know, I had talked about the NAACP call for some changes in police oversight. One of them was a citizens review boards, but a lot of places are calling for, you know, how do we fund and support community or neighborhood groups? How do we put more money into community centers so that people have a place to be that will support their needs? How do we, you know, can we set up a bunch of different hotlines instead of just calling 911 if there's a problem? What if we were able to call somebody who was a mental health professional and that would be able to come and help somebody out who might be having a mental health crisis? We had said before that making decisions in those moments is a big weight on the shoulders of the police, and having more opportunities and more avenues and more support in a lot of different ways so that we can address the needs of our community in ways that are other than punitive, right? You call the police in, that's because you want something stopped or you want something taken away, right? Or you want something mitigated. And that's sort of the training that the police go through. Let's have more people who have different types of training to help out all of the needs of our community. So it's not saying, you know, so that's how I interpret defunding the police.
Yeah, I think all the suggestions you added in is a key component in addressing the needs in our whole community. So not just certain groups of people, but throughout everyone. So mahalo for that response. Does anybody have any other input or anything? Mr. King?
Yeah, I think that these are, for a lot of people, these are newer concepts, right? And I will definitely say that I do not know enough about, you know, all the pieces within both what does defunding the police mean, you know, but I appreciate what Ms. MacGregor shared, because I think that that's, you know, that idea of reinvesting, you know, is really about the source. I think sometimes what people get caught up in is the language, and the word defund makes it sound like, oh, no money for the police. And then that makes people be like, whoa, that seems like really big. And so again, how do we kind of find out more and not just go off our initial reaction based on what a word looks like or what we think it might mean? You know, and the qualified immunity piece, that's another one where, like, you know, I'm in no way an expert on that. You know, from what I've heard and what I know is it's the idea around different government officials, particularly I think in this conversation, it's really around law enforcement and officers that, you know, qualified immunity sometimes means they may not be held legally responsible for certain actions, and there's different stipulations around what those might be, and whether or not they can be taken to court for some of those. And so there's a movement around, like, should that still be the case? What should the parameters be around that? You know, and so, you know, that's an ongoing thing right now that I think a lot of people are trying to, one, figure out where they stand, and then two, figure out, like, okay, if a change, what would a change look like, and what would that mean? You know, but I think something that's important to state, just like in any profession, there, you know, in education there are, you know, I want all educators to be amazing and awesome. And so many are, and there are unfortunately some people that don't do the right things as educators, and there needs to be accountability for that, I feel. And I think that that's true, and that should be true in all sectors, because we want to make sure that we're providing the best for the people that we're serving. You know, and so again, the qualified immunity, I think, is people looking at, you know, what are the ways that accountability can happen for public officials in these different sectors to help ensure that it's the best possible people that are serving their communities.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of questions that could be asked visually speaking for educators or officials. And to go back to what you said about the word defunding, you know, financially speaking, there may be a different definition. So you want to make sure that you identify what the word means, because you never know if it could cause, you know, a problem or a commotion. So thank you for your response. Mrs. MacGregor, do you have something to add?
Oh yeah, I had just forgotten to talk about that qualified immunity piece. So while Mr. King was talking, I was like, oh yeah, I haven't looked up the specifics for that either. I think some really great, you could ask, I know that Black Lives Matter has outlined it on their website. You could also ask the police department, what does that mean? What does that look like? What's your understanding of that? And then I always go to the legal definition. So I'm here at the Cornell Law School website again, and it talks about, it says, qualified immunity protects a government official from lawsuits alleging that the official violated a plaintiff's rights. So a plaintiff being somebody who's charging that person or saying they violated my rights. Only suits where officials violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. So you have to make it really clear that there was something that happened that went against the Constitution. But again, I think, you know, the big part of this is saying, okay, well, I want to write down my own definition of what that means to me, how I would interpret that. And then I always tell people to think up an example too. Like, what does this mean? Or what does this look like? And then go from there. So that's a really great question. I'm really glad that the Facebook viewers came up with that. It sounds like there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge and questions about really specific things. And that tells me that you're doing a lot of work to really try and figure this out. And that's great.
Yeah, mahalo for all your responses. Even throughout the whole discussion, I feel like it's very inspiring for not only us on the Zoom right now, but people on social media like Facebook Live and hopefully YouTube, and they'll be able to see through others' perspectives. And so before we close today, I would like to invite our students who helped put this together to introduce themselves.
Aloha, my name is Kina and I am 10 years old. I will be a 5th grader next year in the Hillsborough School District, and I identify as Filipino, but I am also English, German, Spanish, and Chinese. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Meima. I am an incoming freshman in the Beaverton School District. I'm 14 years old, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Koku. I am a sophomore in the Beaverton School District. I'm 15, and my pronouns are she or her, hers.
Aloha, my name is Ku'ule. I am going to be an incoming junior in the Beaverton School District, and my personal pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I identify as Native Hawaiian, Finnish, English, and Chinese. Thank you. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Sophia. I identify as Japanese, German, and Chinese Filipino, and I am a 7th grader in the Beaverton School District. And my personal pronouns are she, her, hers.
Aloha, my name is Noelani. I am an incoming freshman in the Beaverton School District, and I identify as Native Hawaiian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and Russian.
Hi. Aloha, my name is Kamaliʻi. I am 10 years old. I identify as Hawaiian, Portuguese, and Chinese. I am an incoming 6th grader. I go to the Beaverton School District. My pronouns are he, him, his. Thank you again. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Haley. I am 15 years old and I am a rising sophomore in the Beaverton School District. I identify as she, her, and hers. And I also identify as Japanese and Portuguese.
Hi, my name is Chloe. I'm 14 and I'm an incoming freshman in the Beaverton School District. I identify as Mexican and Puerto Rican, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Okay.
My name is Kamaliʻi and I'm 8 years old. I am Native Hawaiian and I'm in the Beaverton School District. Mahalo.
Aloha, my name is Kulipo. I am a second-year college student at Oregon State University. I've been helping out a little bit with the panel, and thank you for watching and participating. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Mahalo nui loa to our amazing panelists and to all the youth that joined us today. We hope that today's talk story session has helped you understand and answer many of the questions you also had. Like we said before, we hope to use this platform as a safe space for all youth to come together and talk about the issues that we, a key component of today's society, are faced with as we move into the future. No subject is off limits. We hope to continue these sessions weekly, and we need you, our peers, friends, and family. For more information or ways to be involved, please email kaelele@kalohcc.org or visit www.kalohcc.org. Again, mahalo nui for joining us, and we will see you next time.